Hello, listeners. Welcome to Ideas, Innovative Dialogues in Educational Approaches and Scholarship podcast series in the Research Hub at the Faculty of Education, Simon Fraser University. This is Shaila, your host. I'd like to acknowledge that all Ideas podcasts are recorded at Simon Fraser University, whose three campuses are located on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam nations. Listeners, we are excited to welcome Dr. Kathleen Forrester with us today. Here is a little bio of her. Kathleen Forrester is a recent PhD graduate from Simon Fraser University in the Faculty of Education. In fall 2024, under the supervision of Dr. Elizabeth Marshall, she defended her SHARC-supported doctoral thesis, Changing the Story, Queer Whirling Kinship in Picturebooks. Kathleen also has an MA in Children's Literature from the University of British Columbia, where she wrote a hybrid creative critical thesis, which included a middle grade novel manuscript that went on to be longlisted for the 2017 Times Chicken House Children's Fiction Competition. Kathleen has published peer-reviewed papers on topics related to children's literature in various international journals and edited collections. Kathleen has a lot of accolades, and her full bio is available on our webpage. Hello, Kathleen. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Hi, Shyla. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Kathleen, we'd like to start with knowing you. Yeah, so my first question for you is, please tell us something about yourself.
Well, I live here in East Vancouver, but you may be able to tell from my accent that I possibly you can tell I grew up somewhere else. So I'm here on Coast Salish, unceded Coast Salish territories, and I come from previously another settler state, Australia, on Bundjalung country, and I moved here when I was in my mid-20s and did various things, but children's literature, which is, you know, the heart and soul of my academic and sometimes personal life, um, really was always there. And so after various employments, I returned to university and did my master's in children's literature at UBC, as you mentioned. And it was a fantastic multidisciplinary program that really opened a lot of doors. And in particular, it was wonderful to be able to bring together creative writing with critical thinking, because of course those things are not so far apart. Yeah, so that's a sense of what sort of brings me up academically toward engaging through the Faculty of Education with children's literature.
Wow. Thanks, Kathleen. And for the background, like how you became interested and which led you to your PhD research and your interest in children's literature and picture books. Um, so here I have another question. Your PhD studies, and here I quote from your thesis defense abstract. You said, in conversation with the interdisciplinary fields of queer ecologies and feminist science and technology studies, and learning from Indigenous theorists and storytellers, I look to picture books as speculative companions for imaging otherwise. I suggest that picture books, brimming with cross-species, multi-kind, more than human collaborations, and odd kin encounters, can admit our imaginations to realities and relationalities that might otherwise pass by. Could you please tell us more? What did you mean by this? And what exposures brought you to this topic, children's literature, picture books, queer ecologies, and many more, as mentioned in your bio, and as
Yeah,
you hint while you're telling us about yourself?
thank you for that question. It is so fun and to trace one's journey backwards. And I did do this in preparation for my defense, which was in December of 2024, so not that long ago. I'm still sort of in recovery mode, actually. But something that brought me really a through line that came through from my master's is queer kinship and thinking about well, I was thinking about representation in my master's. I was thinking about inclusivity and representation of family and kin and queer family and kin, um, relational practices and models uh, as they show up in children's literature. And I should take a moment just to say, when I say children's literature, I mean it could mean YA, young adult fiction, or it could mean picture books for children, or it could mean um, cultural artifacts of childhood, or it could even mean discussions about childhood. So it's quite a broad field in that regard. So queer kinship was something that I came to my research thinking about, and I came to work with Dr. Beth Marshall. She's a really well-respected children's lit scholar who had already been a mentor of sorts to me, so it was wonderful to come and work with her. And I wanted to. So, queer welding is something that I kind of came upon as a way to move past representation only as a point of interest and to think more broadly toward human and more than human relationality. And it was Donna Haraway's work in particular that sort of sparked this idea that my own sort of theoretical interests, queer theory, it's so good at disrupting norms, destabilizing binaries, could be taken up as a really important theoretical framework of sorts, rubric, to disrupt even the human and non-human binary. And that actually, if we're really going to start thinking about justice and about relationality, then we cannot sort of the elephant in the room, so to speak, is the environment and the more than human world and the ecologies about us, which are, of course, we are a part of. And so I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but these were sort of questions that were coming up at the beginning of my research. Um, and Haraway had a big role in that, and thinking about kinship had a big role in that, and then thinking about more than human queer kinship. Queer welding became something that was for disruption and imagination. It was something that could critique existing models that have concretized, for example, modernity, Western ideas about the nuclear heteropatriarchal family as being the only model of kinship, uh, could critique that, but at the same time not get stuck in the critique, could begin to open up ways of noticing and also imagining and telling other stories about kinship models that exist and that might exist.
That's really fascinating. Thank you so much, Kathleen. And yeah, I'm learning a lot of things from your work, and then it's so wonderful to see how the queer theories, and as you mentioned, it disrupts the binaries, the conventional existing norms, and aim for more, which, like you said, it may exist or may not, but it's a way of exploration, and it's what researchers do. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. Now, why picture books? That's my next question to you. And yeah, why are you interested in picture books? And what do you mean by changing the story?
Right. Well, I love picture books. And so it's easy for me to come at them, but I think picture books are actually quite radical texts and a fantastic um, tactile objects that can be chewed upon if you wish to, that are great to do queer theory with, great to do philosophy with. They're these multimodal worlds. So we have visual and verbal worlds, and you're reading between those worlds and across those worlds. There are also spaces where you can get away with a lot. These sort of characters, some mythical, some not, things that we would think of as inanimate. The moon, perhaps, is talking to a rabbit. Uh, there are worlds where what if is always and often at the forefront. So, what if, as in P.D. Eastman's sort of classic picture book, to give an example, um, we see a baby bird asking a big digger machine, "Are you my mother?" And we look at this and we read it to children, and we often don't realize that a little rupturing is happening because it means that things do not have to be as they are, and we can't imagine otherwise. And so I think children's books are always doing that work and are these fantastic places for what Jack Halberstam might call like low theory, like non-elite. You're not necessarily going to find every scholar working with children's books, but there is so much richness there. So it is a passion of mine to work with picture books, but also I think that they are not to be overlooked, or maybe that's part of their beauty that they are overlooked. Um, a little bit subversive there with picture books. The changing the story aspect of my work, which is that's part of the title of the thesis, changing the story, queer worlding kinship in picture books. Uh, it again kind of comes back to Donna Haraway, but also people like Dakota scholar Kim Tallbear, who are insisting that we must change the narrative of progress, of bounded individualism, of siloed nuclear families that only care for their biological genetic kin. How do we shift our response and responsibility to one another to engage in collective care that is specific to who we are and who we are connected to in our world? And that, of course, is a more than human world because we are part of the world. We are not separate to the world and to our environment. And of course, our skin is not a barrier. We have worlds within us also. A side note, I'm very into making sourdough bread, and there is these amazing multi-species worlds in sourdough, and that in some ways often informed my thinking and kind of made it into parts of my thesis too. So this is the changing the stories. Changing the story of kinship is kind of changing the story of how do we notice the incredible kin arrangements that are already taking place that bring us to this moment and that are emergent in this moment. And also, I guess another side note, but it's not so side, is, in the pandemic, I was really noticing that there are communities who are already good at practicing networks of kin and care across households, in community, in these queer and crip ways that are not bound to this idea of a nuclear household and this separate entity. And that really, so much of this work, which I often frame as imagining otherwise, is also just learning to notice what is already here and to listen and learn from uh, Indigenous folks, from people of color, from crip and queer folks who have other kinship modalities that are already happening, and to respectfully pay attention and imagine otherwise from there. So what we inherit and then what we create are very connected in that regard.
Thank you, Kathleen. That's wonderful. And I really like how you situated your work, kinship, in a human and a more than human world. And it's something about learning every day from what is out there already. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I have another question for you. And this is about your teaching practices. As you have done your research, you're now Dr. Kathleen Forrester, having finished your PhD, but you've also been teaching at SFU. So my next question is about that. So you have taught at a master's program at SFU, and so I had the opportunity to look up your course, and so it focuses on, and again, I quote here from your course description, that environmental justice within and ecologies of children's and young adult literature. So you mentioned some of the lines of scholarship already that informed your research. Now, how does your research inform your practices as you teach?
Yes, I was very privileged to teach a master's course. Actually, it was quite a busy time because it was also while I was preparing for my defense. It was in those final months. But in some ways, this was such a privilege and an honor, and it really supported my process because I was finally, writing a thesis is such an isolating experience sometimes. And I was really in conversation with 13 teachers. They are all teachers in this program. It's part of the community graduate program. It's a pilot sort of, I don't know if pilot's the right word, but it's the first time it's been offered, a children's literature program for teachers wanting to do their masters through SFU. And Beth Marshall, my supervisor, had this happening, and I was so privileged to be able to take my own interests and create this course, which I called Ecologies of Children's Literature, which was really an interdisciplinary look that was also a very personal look at our own eco-pedagogies, and had these rich and delicious conversations that really um, moved across really vast areas whether we were talking about petroculture in relation to a book like Jules Parker Rhodes' Bayou Magic, or whether we were looking at the idea of the eco hero that pops up in all these children's books, picture books. We have the child savior who's come to save the day, and it really bypasses the collective action piece. Um, or whether we were looking at the human-animal relation, or whether we were interrogating our own positionalities, many of us as settlers in that class. Um, yeah, and we had the opportunity to also read a lot of work by Indigenous scholars, and also the fantastic Caldecott winning picture book, We Are Water Protectors by Carol Lindstrom and Michaela Goad. So it was I would say, a really diverse array of materials that we looked at, and it was close to my heart, but it was really enriching to me because the students, what I brought was just a starting point, and what they brought back to me was huge, and really supported me through my defense in many ways. So teaching can be a gift in that regard, and that certainly was my experience.
Thanks, Kathleen. It's wonderful. Teaching is such a rewarding experience. I do agree with you. You mentioned about your writing process, that it can be isolating. And you also mentioned the months where you're preparing for your defense. So I want to ask you something at this point about your thesis writing process and the type of thesis that you have done. So you mentioned that you have done a manuscript-based thesis, and this is something I'm really interested to know about, and I'm sure that there are students out there who are considering a manuscript-based thesis. So we would like to know more about this from you. So yeah, like, why did you decide to choose this format? And how do you do a manuscript-based thesis?
Yeah, so I didn't come into the program realizing that I would do a manuscript-based thesis. It was a very emergent, as was all my research, and as is, I think, many people's research. We come in, what am I doing? Why am I here? Um, and I think that can be honored. So, but I do recall in one of my first classes, it was generally discouraged for folks in at least the ETAP, Educational Theory and Practice program, to do it. And I think that that was probably for practical reasons, that it takes a long time to go through the whole process of submitting and publishing. And then, you have to do that multiple times to have multiple chapters. But I'd already had some publishing experience, and I am someone who only works if I have a deadline to work to. And so I tend to surround myself with deadlines because there aren't a lot in a PhD, honestly. It's just this long stretch before you. So I lined up conferences and wrote a lot of conference papers and attended a lot of conferences. And from those papers, I tended to then write papers and submit them to academic journals and also to anthologies that were coming out. So I ended up with three of them, and one of them is still forthcoming in a few months, that were perfect as they were. I mean, I don't know if perfect might be an overstatement, but it works. A good thesis is a done thesis. And so they worked really well as manuscripts, for a manuscript-based thesis. And that's at some point, my supervisor and committee pointed that out to me. And you don't have to rewrite all of this. You could actually just do this. You've already done the work. And so then it was really about realizing how wonderful it was to see the journey that had taken across, because they were all really connected around different picture books, but But the research through line was there. The idea that stories enable and constrain the questions we can ask. And so that it enables and constrains the worlds we can imagine. So, what are these stories about kinship, and what questions are we asking, and what worlds might we yet imagine or notice that are already here? That was there through them all. But there was also a big interdisciplinary journeying, a shifting of paradigms that kind of happened through them. And the nice thing about a manuscript-based thesis is that you can write these, well, I think in education, you're actually asked to write these bridging pages that really connect. And then you have your introduction and conclusion, of course, that do that in a much bigger way. So that's how I came to do a manuscript-based thesis. And what a relief when I realized I didn't have to rewrite those papers into a whole other way of presenting the material.
Thanks, Kathleen. This is really very useful information. I'm like everything you said about your thesis, your research. It has been fascinating to listen to you about your work, and your information on the manuscript-based thesis is just so useful. So, what I gather from what you have said that you need to have articles published in journals, and then you need to kind of tie them, weave them so there need to be some common elements that are going to weave the chapters or the articles together, those bridging pieces, as you publish them in the form of a thesis.
Yes,
Mhm,
that's right. And you know what was
mhm.
interesting and maybe challenging at times is that I couldn't find many examples in education of this. And I did find some, but there isn't an easy search tool, even in the thesis summit at the library, to find manuscript script-based thesis. And even logistical questions around formatting. How do we format this? If they all have different citational styles, do I keep that or do I change them all to be the same citation? You know, all of these questions that I was sort of nutting out along the way that I'm sure others have as well, which made me think it would be really great. Student to student to really start to find ways to share that information because it is a fantastic option as one way to write a thesis.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this topic solely on how to do a manuscript-based thesis and all these very important questions that you just mentioned. And one doesn't even think about these questions before they go into doing this certain kind of thesis. Because yes, obviously you're submitting to different journals and they may have different citations. So what do you do? These are very practical questions, and which is why I think this topic alone deserves a separate podcast, a separate interview.
I'd be happy to chat more about it anytime.
Sure, I think we should do another podcast on this topic only. But for today, it's time to wrap up. And it has been wonderful chatting with you and knowing about your very, very important research. So thank you so much again, Kathleen, for joining us today and for sharing about your work.
Thank you, Shyla. It's been a real pleasure.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and it has been a very insightful and meaningful conversation, a learning experience. So, thank you so much for joining us today, for supporting ideas, for being with ideas, and please stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you all.